memory. The Foucaultians claiming from the workers' autonomy movement, claiming that real revolutionaries have no memory and therefore are free to conceive new ideas and create new forms of struggle, which actually they didn't. Anyway, this kind of debate makes no sense at all for a number of reasons. In the first place, because memory is neither good or bad. Memory just is. We cannot control entirely whether we remember or forget, or how our memory functions. Most of the time, memory acts like an involuntary muscle, a sheer reflex, independent of our rational intentions and will. In a way, it's like breathing. We can teach ourselves to breathe better, we can breathe cleaner air, but we cannot stop ourselves breathing. Like breathing, memory is a function that we can train, practice, improve, but never suppress. No wonder that the figure of involuntary memory recurs in a number of key literary texts, from Marcel Proust's Madeleine to Don DeLillo to Toni Morrison. Furthermore, if too much memory may choke the imagination, too little memory or an absence of memory may cause us to forget that certain things have already been tried, and so that we will actually repeat the past while deluding ourselves that we are inventing something new, which is indeed what a lot of those radicals were doing in the 60s in Italy. So both the weight of memory and the likeness of forgetting militate against a critical, conscious relationship with the past and with the present. Yuri Lotman and Boris Ouspensky, two Russian semiologists, and Italian semiologist Umberto Eco, suggested that given that memory is a constant remaking of meaning, wait a second, let's see what happens when you read. Let's get to that. But it did make sense anyway. It's not just a matter of words. Italian culture seems obsessed with anniversary, centennial celebrations, and thus obsessed with a ritual load of memory. However, in 1912, we had a centennial anniversary which was entirely ignored. It was 100 years from the Italian invasion and occupation of Libya. We choose not to remember that the first aerial bombing in human history was carried out by Italian planes in Libya. We choose not to remember the concentration camps in which in 1914, long before the advent of fascism, Italy imprisoned Libyan resistors. Now, this erasure memory has allowed us to repeat exactly in 2012 what we had done in 1912. We bombed Libya again. And we treated Libyan migrants exactly the same way as we had treated Libyan prisoners of war from 1912 to 1931. On the other hand, contrasting memory and oblivion is a mistake, also because oblivion is a necessary part of memory. The Uruguayan poet Mario de Benedetti said, in a phrase which is etched on such a tragic place of memory as Villa Grimaldi in Santiago de Chile, he says, El olvido está lleno de memoria, forgetfulness is filled with memory. Or, as Jorge Luis Borges wrote, el olvido es una de las formas de la memoria, su vago sótano, la otra casa secreta de la memoria, the deep cellar, the other secret side of the coin of memory. Thus, remembering everything, as in Borges' metaphor of the emperor's cartographers, means remembering nothing. Memory is not a storage of data. It is rather a permanent search for meaning, in which forgetting filters out the traces of experiences that no longer have meaning, or that mean too much. Thus, Borges' image of the Sultan, of the cellar, connects with Mario Benedetti's image of the Gran Simulacro Recreto de Fantasmas, a huge simulacrum filled with ghosts. Ghosts are the memories that are not forgotten but suppressed and surface again to trouble us as soon as control is relaxed. Yuri Lotman and Boris Ouspensky, as I said, have pointed out that forgetting is an essential memory, mechanism of cultural memory. because there's cultural memory has just enough space, and in order to make space for new memories, that you had to get rid of older ones and erase what has become meaningless by turning oblivion into a mechanism of recollection. However, they also notice that sometimes we obliterate what means too much. Umberto Eco says that cultures teach individuals to forget not only what is rejected because it is useless, but also to hide what they ought to remember. Lotman and Ouspensky refer to a censorship imposed by totalitarian states. But we may recognize similar attempts to legislate memory and oblivion also in states that do their best to be democratic. The efforts to promote oblivion of the MACMA, the so-called Pacto del Olvido in Spain, the Ley de Punto Final in Argentina, the erasure of colonial war crimes from public discourse in Italy. In all these cases, the censored memories do not go away, but surface again as involuntary and threatening ghosts and nightmares, often with very tangible bodies, that haunt the consciousness and the society that attempts to erase them. This is why the involuntary memories in Don DeLillo's Underworld or Toni Morrison's Beloved do not evoke idols of the past, but a sense of guilt and fear over an old crime or over the violence of the slave plantation. Seta, the heroine of Beloved, is just walking through a field, and suddenly the image of the plantation arises before her mind. And she says, although there was not a leaf on that farm that did not make her want to scream, it rolled itself out before her in shameless beauty. It never looked as terrible as it was, and made her wonder if hell was a pretty place too. Fire and brimstone all right, but hidden in lazy groves. Boys hanging from the most beautiful sycamores in the world. The contrast between the beauty of the landscape and the violence that inhabit suggests two possible modes of memory. Memory as pacifier and memory as disturbance. The cliché of memory as weight and mere repetition ultimately is the result of an idea of memory as mere container, unchanging, forever frozen. We might describe this image as memory as monument. In this mode of memory, usually, which is usually imposed by the institutions, by the state, it's a form of commemoration and celebration of ourselves as heroes or victims or both in the past. It's a memory that serves the purpose of making us feel good about ourselves, so that we can go on being the same as we have been so far. We've been victimized, we've been heroes, and we remember this. Italy is especially good at recalling itself as victim and erasing itself as perpetrator. Memory, in fact, is also a process that is much more useful if it makes us uneasy, that if it questions the certainties and the beliefs on which we rest. And I believe that the task of oral history, especially in places of conflict and conflicted origins, is precisely that of disturbing the dominant narrative by raising, listening, and voicing the negated ghosts from the present and the past. And I would like to discuss this function of memory as disturbance in the context of a memory event widely celebrated in Italy in 2011, the 150th anniversary of the establishment of Italy as a united nation. And the key word, the label which we use to remember and to define the history of the Italian movement for independence is Risorgimento. It means a new birth. Something dead that comes back to life. Which reminds me what Toni Morrison says about this. Anything dead coming back to life hurts. So the question is, we cannot understand the meaning of this risorgimento, or of any national origin, unless we ask where it is that coming back to life, it hurts. So where does a rebirth of Italy hurt? We can find hints, not so much in the consolidated memory of monuments, of textbooks and everything, Garibaldi, museums, which is useful. Which is useful, and I appreciate it. But rather in the more secret and ungraspable memory that is passed on in families, in personal and private narratives. In other words, in oral history. And often, what is so respectable from the point of view of official narrative becomes less respectable in family and personal memory. I had this interview, a quote from an interview that I did in Terni, which was where I grew up, with a lady many years ago. She says, my father's father, he joined Garibaldi, Garibaldi is our national hero, and he went a day with Garibaldi on the day that he had married my grandmother. She was 14, he was 18. After the wedding, he says, all right, let's go home. I'm going to the store to buy some food. You go home and wait for me. And on the way to the store, he ran into Garibaldi and all his troops that was marching on the way to Sicily, and he up and went to Sicily with them. My grandmother waited at home for 3 days, locked in, waiting for her husband to come back from the store. Anyway, he came back after a long time. He had been in the war. So the foundation narrative, the glorious ancestor of whom we are proud because we fought with Garibaldi and liberated the South, is also a memory of abandonment and irresponsibility. And the lady says, after that, the family disinherited them. And so he said, I don't want anything. So they migrated and came to Terni, which is a founding narrative of themselves as a still working class family. Another lady, also a descendant of Garibaldini, had the same story. My grandfather was studying to be a priest, and he ran away from the convent. He took to the bush. He was in the woods, and Garibaldi came through the wood, and he went along with Garibaldi. Garibaldi is always coming through. He ended up spending the family fortune for the cause. In each birth of a nation, then we have a break and a healing. The dynamics of revolution, constitution, which are at the root of the United States history, and perhaps of Italian history too, as Risorgimento as a movement, unification as consolidation. The key story about the U.S. Independence War is Rip Van Winkle, where the hero falls asleep before the revolution and wakes up when everything's done and then the peace is back. We have exactly the same narrative in a story by Feliciano Pelusini, a Tuscan writer, and the hero falls asleep in 1848 and wakes up in 1969, and he doesn't have to go through the trauma of, quote-unquote trauma of liberation. So each birth of a nation then is a creation of a new order, but also the break and the violation of an older one. Memory, as always is often the case with trauma, sets itself out to exorcise the conflict. And this is what happens with the story of Feliciano Pelusini and Rip Van Winkle. We just sleep through it, which means we just ignore what we did and what happened in those violent times when our nation was born. There are 3 R's in Italian history: Rinascimento, Risorgimento, Resistenza. The first 2 are metaphors. The third, Resistenza, is not. People actually did physically resist. Yet, just like the Risorgimento, but more openly and publicly, the resistance has been the ground of a conflict between pacifying, satisfactory public narratives, the united struggle of all Italian people against invasion and oppression, and suppressed, troubling, and problematic memories. Once again, the conflict hinges on the meaning of the birth and rebirth of the nation. On September 8, 1943, Italy signed an armistice with the Allies, breaking away from the alliance with Nazi Germany. And using a metaphor, there is a sort of mirror image to the Risorgimento as a new birth. Historian Ernesto Galli della Loggia coined the phrase, death of the nation. The institutions were dissolved, the army disbanded, the king and the court and all the generals fled to the south without even warning the poor soldiers. So the Italy that had been born in 1861, monarchic, liberal, fascist, disappears. Yet on the very same day, the very opposite process takes place. Individual citizens and loosely organized groups take to the street in an attempt to stop the Nazis from occupying the city of Rome. The day ended in defeat and in a massacre of resistance fighters. Yet other narrators and other memories see that day not as the death of a country, but as the birth of a new Italy, an Italy founded on the participatory sovereignty and subjectivity of its own citizens. And no wonder, the communist underground cells called themselves patriotic action groups. They took names from the Risorgimento. The resistance was described as the second Risorgimento, and the theoretical journal of the Communist Party would be called Rinascita, rebirth. So, once again, something that coming back to life. And where does it hurt? Because the metaphor of the new Risorgimento is used very much in the mode of memory as monument. The official narrative is, we Italians rose against oppression and invasion, and all the monuments you see to the resistance, they're about the dying partisan. On the one hand, we ignore that a sizable portion of Italy kept on fighting on the side of the Nazis and helping with the deportation of the Jews and the political prisoners. We pretended to ignore this for decades. And it came back. It came back as a ghost of the anti-fascist, revisionist historical narrative. We also ignore the fact that the partisans who were involved in the just war against fascism and Nazism shot and killed. There's no trace of this conflict as a civil war, as Claudio Pavone described it. I remember a textbook which says that for many years, in order to represent the new republic as everyone's homeland, some felt it necessary to alter the representation of history by pretending that all Italians who were not active fascists were also anti-fascists, and denying that those who fought with Mussolini were also Italian, and forgetting the massacres perpetrated by the communist partisans on our eastern border. And this again comes back as a ghost to haunt us. In fact, and then it says, this, however, has to stop. But these ghosts are also haunting the personal memory of many who fought in the resistance. Because there's a huge contradiction there. As they fought in the resistance, they were inevitably involved in actions that were necessary, but that conflicted with their own conscience and with the ethics of the peacetime in which they remembered. Unlike the fascists, the partisans were not bearer of an ideology of violence and death, but they used violence and they gave death. And killing is an act against nature, says partisan Carla Caponi, one of the great heroines of the Italian resistance. When she recalls her first armed action, you always kill a little piece of yourself, she said. See, there's a trauma of the victims, but there's a trauma of those who, for a higher goal, were compelled to actions that they did not think were right, but did them anyway. Lucia Ottobrini, she also fought in the resistance. She blew up trucks with Nazi soldiers and everything. She's a very deeply spiritual woman, and she summed it up one day. We were just chatting. She says, during the resistance, I thought, it's as though I was transgressing. I was ashamed to speak to him. I said to him, whom? Capital A, Jesus. She says, yes. I couldn't speak to him. And I think back on it, and I say, how strange was it really me? And she says, I started speaking to Jesus again after it was all over. And I said, because you thought he wouldn't understand what you were doing. And she says, yes, he wouldn't. Jesus will understand what we were doing. So she had to suspend her own deepest identity. And this, I think, is a deep, deep hurt in this glorious narrative. One partisan who was in one of the great military victories of the partisans in central Italy recalled, after you've been 6, 8 months, a year in the mountains, when you come down, you're a half animal. No two ways about it. I was no longer a normal human being. Today I say I was an animal. I realized that in those times I was out of my mind. You come down the mountain with all that hate, all that fighting, the guns, all the time you expected a shot in the back. So you brought yourself to such a frenzy that when it was over, it wasn't easy. It wasn't easy. And ultimately, this generates silence. I could no longer speak about it, says Rosario Bentivegna, the most eponymous hero of the Italian, of the Roman resistance. These are unauthorized memories in public discourse, involuntary memories in personal recollection, and disturbing memories in both. In Don DeLillo's Underworld, whenever the narrator is invaded by disturbing involuntary memories, his relationship with his father, the killing of the mafioso in the Bronx, the stream of consciousness is interrupted by formulas, repeated identical and out of context, boxed in discursive fragments that emerge automatically to block dangerous thoughts, which, however, are exactly what contains these formulas. The most frequent of these formulas concerns the obsession with the disposal of domestic waste. That is, the object out of place, impure, unpleasant, precisely like those memories that are disposed of. Therefore, morphologically, the formula represents the obsession of control. That covers up and hides what lurks underneath, and that all the things we're pushing out. It is exactly what we need to see and hear, what lurks out of sight, because it helps us better understand who we are and how we became who we are, which, in the end, is what memory and oral history are for.